Hey gang, Mark LeBlanc welcoming you back to the Alley Cat Workshop. I'm currently working on the hutch for the cabinets for my former regiment, the Royal Canadian Hussars. Now, I'm at the stage right now where I need to cut a number of rabbets and dados in all the different walls that will constitute the hutch. And in the past I would have used my dado set in my table saw, but I bought this Bora Router Plate a couple of months ago and I really enjoyed using it for a couple of reasons. One is you have to do very little measurements in order to set it up and use it, and the other thing is that it will accommodate the precise thickness of the material that you're using. So for example, this is a 3/4 inch plywood. Now if I use my calipers, I'm set at 3/4 and locked in, and you'll see that this is quite loose. In fact, if I just loosen this and take the measurement, this turns out to 87/128 inches, which is a measurement that I certainly don't want to reproduce using a stacked dado set with shims and whatever. So this tool, this jig, actually lets you set up very good looking and precise dados just by using the material itself as a thickness guide. And just using a router with the appropriate router bit, in this case this is a 1/2 inch router bit, then you can cut dados very simply, very easily in a very little time. Now, I've done a video on the Bora Router Plate before. What I thought I would do in this case is actually walk you through a couple of use cases, things that are common, and show you how I set it up, how I set up the router plate for use, and to show you some of the best practices that I've adopted with this. The first best practice is to make sure that your router bit is precisely what it should be. So in my case, I want to use a 1/2 inch router bit, and I had to measure this to make sure that it was a 1/2 inch router bit, because my previous one was slightly under, and that created that actually did not work with the system very well. So let me show you a couple of the use cases on the board that I've got set up here, and I'll walk you through how to use everything. So what I found in using the system is that there are really two different variables that are really key to setting up the router plate and using it properly. The first variable is the cut that you want to make. Is it going to be on the right side or on the left side of your fence? Because you can use the router plate in both of these dispositions. This is the right side of the fence, and of course this is the left. The second variable is, where is your reference line? So let me explain using two examples here what the reference lines, the ones that I'm talking about. So I have set up on this board places where I want to cut 2 rabbets, one at the bottom, one at the very top, and also a dado at 8 inches from the bottom. So let's take a look at these two examples here, this rabbet and this dado. In this case, my reference line is the bottom of my board. Why? Because I want the piece of stock that's going to be protruding out of this rabbet to be flush with the bottom of the plywood board that I've got here. So the reference point, bottom. But in the case of this dado, the reference point is the top. I want there's going to be a shelf here that's going to run all the way through, and this shelf I want to be precisely at 8 inches from the bottom. So the reference line actually turns out to be closest to the fence, while in the first case the reference line is farthest from the fence. So why is this important? It's important because based on where your reference line is, you're going to use the router plate slightly differently in order to dial in where you want your fence to be. So let me walk you through example 1, which is the rabbet, and you'll start to understand what I'm talking about here. All right, so off camera, I have set up my fence for the cut. So here's what I did. Because in this case, my reference point on this rabbet is furthest away from the fence, I have dialed in the thickness of the material onto the router plate. So now this thing is set up for whatever thickness this piece of plywood is. Second thing I did is I put 2 marks, one at the beginning and one at the end, which is 1/4 inch away from my reference line, which is the bottom. Why 1/4 inch? Because that's half of what my 1/2 inch router is. So when I do my first pass, I'm expecting my router to basically cut up until this 1/4 inch mark for the very first cut. Okay, my bad here. I want the router bit to cut as much material as possible while cutting right up to the edge of the plywood. Since the router bit is a 1/2 inch, if I use a 1/4 inch offset, my setup will be perfect. And then the rest is going to be taken care of in the second cut. Now, to line up the fence, I put in the router plate and I manually and very carefully lined up this mark, which is right here on the router plate, which indicates the center of the router bit. And I did this, whoops, let me just go back a little bit, on both sides. Hope you see that. Hope that's clear enough. Once I had these 2 marks lined up, clamped down the fence, checked whoops, again, you're going too far, but checked everything again. So now my fence, my router plate, everything is properly dialed in. I'm ready to make my cut. So the first cut I'm going to do is going to be on this mark. Then after that, I will move my router plate back, and I'm using, there's a 1/2 inch reference point here, so that's going to give me the offset that I need for the 1/2 inch router bit, and I'll make my second cut, and the second cut should give me exactly what I need in order to have a flush line on the outside. All right, let me suit up and let's do our cuts. So once the first cut is done, loosen those little knobs, collapse the router plate, and make the second cut. This one is going to be closest to the fence. So for this second use case, the setup is going to be a little bit similar, but the sequence is going to be different. So what I've done off camera is I've secured my fence, so it's all dialed in. Now to do this, let's recall here that my reference line is the one closest to the fence, so it's this one over here. I put 2 marks at 1/4 inch from this top line. One over here on this edge of the board, and another one over there on the other side. What I did is I very carefully took, let's show that. I very carefully lined up the router plate so that the center mark is in line with that 1/4 inch mark on, and I need to show you this. Here we go. Can we see it? Yep, there we go. On both sides. Now that the router plate is properly locked in, what I need to do is I need to account for the thickness of my material. So I'm going to move this over. in my board. And this is tough to do only with one hand. So let's give you a little bit of help. So let me dial in the thickness here. We're good to go. Why am I doing this now? Because the way that this plate or the system works, it is better to route on the right side of the cut first and then the left side, so that your router bit doesn't climb. It has a much smoother cut. So that's why I'm going to start it this way. Hopefully that makes sense for you. So let me suit up and let's get the second, let's get this dado cut rather. So similar to the first use case, I'm going to loosen those little knobs, I'm going to collapse the router plate, and I'm going to make my second cut. Now something is going to happen here, and this is actually a good troubleshooting aspect. Once I've done my second cut, I'm going to use my sample piece and I'm going to test it. I'm going to find that, hey, wait a second, something's wrong, it's not fitting. So what I am going to do is I'm going to dial in the thickness of the board one more time, and then I'm going to do a final cut, but this time I'm going to be pulling so that I don't have the router riding against while making the cut. And that's going to fix the problem. So there's always a way to get around this. That's something to remember. This tool is very flexible in that regard. All right, time for use case number 3. So, in this case, I'm going to be using the router template on the left-hand side of the fence. Now, you could argue that I could flip around and just do the same thing, and you would be absolutely right. But in this case, what I will do is actually I will make my cut from the right-hand side, or from the left-hand side, sorry. So what I did, again, my reference line is this edge over here, made a 1/4 inch mark on both ends, similar approach. Since this is the furthest line away from the fence, I also took, let me grab it here, my sample piece and dialed in the thickness of the board into my router plate, and then I lined up the middle of the router plate with my 1/4 inch marks. Right, so over here, and if I go there, I'm perfectly well lined up. Now, here's what's going to happen. Is if I run my router the right-hand side first, and then the left-hand side, what I'm going to be left with is a very small piece of material on the left-hand side after the first cut. It's going to be kind of in the way. So in this case, what I would suggest, if you're going to be using the router plate in this regard, is to actually do a pull. So instead of pushing the router this way, you're actually pulling it this way, which means that the first cut you're going to be doing is going to be on the far edge. So everything is set up properly now. I'm not going to touch anything, and I'm just going to put my router over here and just pull it across. And once I'm done, I'll do a second cut again by doing a pull after I've reset the fence. So let me suit up again and let me go through this cut.
And once again, collapse the router plate, get ready to do the second cut. And you're going to see in the end, the results are great. The sample piece is exactly flush with the top of my board. So folks, hopefully this thing has been useful. Hit that like button if you can. Leave me a comment if you've got any questions or any comments as to some of the best practices that you use. And subscribe if you haven't done so. I'd appreciate it if you did that. Folks, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you soon.